Greetings, Sheboygan. Welcome to another edition of City Desk. Today we're going to look at the activities and the initiatives that are going on within the Sheboygan Police Department. And today I'd like to welcome Police Chief Chief Domagalski.
Hi, Dave.
Welcome, Chief.
Thanks.
As always, a pleasure, and welcome to the show. Kind of to kick it off, likewise, I'm new to the city and everything with new faces. Could you give us kind of a background as far as how long you've been with the department and some of your high-level plan?
Sure. I've been with the city since January 18th of 2010, so a little over a year and a half now. One of the things that I did when I got here is try to gather background on the information on the department as far as where the department was and where we think that we need to go. And so I did that in a bunch of different ways. One was through conversations with members of the Police and Fire Commission, with the mayor, the members of the Common Council. Interviewed everybody that works in the Sheboygan Police Department to get their take on positive things going on in the department and areas that the department needed improvement. Tried to identify major issues, and then also I held a few community listening sessions to give the public a chance to provide some input on what they thought the department's strengths and weaknesses were. So we used that information then really to try to implement a strategy, and I would describe that strategy as a community-based, neighborhood-focused preventative policing strategy. Essentially what that means is anything that the police does has to be community-based. The police are empowered by the citizens that they serve, and if they don't have community trust and support, they're not able to be effective in doing their job. So we have to make sure that we are community-based and we're able to build those connections, get direction and feedback from the citizens if we're going to achieve what we want. The second thing that we really identified is that neighborhoods are the building block of cities. And so if we're going to have a positive effect on a city, we really need to do things at a neighborhood level. Really, this all ties together because it again allows us to reach out and get that feedback from the citizens by doing this. So what we did, one of the first things that we did when I got there is, I should backtrack just a second. On my first trip around the city with the mayor, one of the things that I asked him about was, tell me about your neighborhood associations that are in the city. And he said, well, we have no neighborhood associations. So that was something that was relatively shocking to me. Yeah. And so one of the things that I thought was important is that we try to develop neighborhood associations, and it doesn't have to be a complicated thing, but really there has to be in place something, whether it's as simple as a neighborhood watch, but some way for citizens to get together and collectively address problems and issues in their neighborhood. So one of the first things that we did was divide the city into neighborhoods and quickly identified some of the groups that were active in the city, Sheboygan Neighborhood Pride being one of them that was involved in trying to support neighborhood associations along with the mayor and several of the alderpersons. So I brought along a map just to illustrate here what we did. So we divided the city into 75 neighborhoods, and then in those neighborhoods we assigned individual officers to be either a primary or a secondary officer to that neighborhood. So each neighborhood has a primary officer that's responsible for it, and then officers on the other two shifts that are secondary officers. So essentially what we gain out of that is we are now gaining accountability because those individual officers can be held accountable for things that happen in those neighborhoods, and they're expected to address problems that occur in those neighborhoods. So that has really been the biggest program that we've put in place, and is the basis for everything we do, trying to build those collaborative relationships with citizens to get information and feedback, which then goes into the third part of the strategy there I talked about is preventative policing. The main primary job of the police really is to control crime, fear, and disorder in the city. And it's not something that the police can do by themselves. They need active neighborhood and citizen engagement, if for no other reason, to identify the problems that are going on. One of the things based on my experience and from talking to other people that you learn, is that there is no one problem in the city. Somebody that lives in one neighborhood down here has a totally different perception of what the problem is or what's going on in their neighborhood than somebody that lives here or up here. So if we're going to be effective, again, we have to have those relationships so we can identify problems that are specific to individual neighborhoods. To assist us in doing that, another one of the problems that were quickly identified is the inability to use the data that we are gathering. This police department has two different systems that are really the same, but yet they're different, and that's a computer-aided or dispatch system or CAD system, which is a computer software system that gathers data when either people call the police or squads respond into self-initiated activity and report that back to dispatchers who enter it in. And then the other system is a records management system, which we log and record everything that we do. So it's great that we're putting all of this information somewhere, but if we can't pull data out of that, we're really useless in many ways. So one of the things that we did from that and trying to use the data that we had is I felt it very necessary from my past experience that the police department have a mapping capability. Because it's one thing to tell an officer, go over into this area and do some work in this area because there's a burglary problem. It's a whole nother thing to be able to give them a visual representation by doing something as simple as putting dots on a map where crime is occurring and saying, here's the map, here's the crime, and letting them see that it really is concentrated in one area and not all over the place.
I think that would also help the officer better prepare going into that area. You can kind of do his homework, so to speak, so that way he's more up on the situation in a neighborhood, so you can kind of rotate.
Exactly,
well, so.
and it goes to this whole thing. It's been said that random patrol gets you random results, and so we don't want to send our officers out not informed on what's going on. We want them to have that information so that they can direct their patrols to where problems are and deal with those problems, rather than just driving around hoping that they run into something or see something. So we developed the mapping capability on our own with the system that we had by using some of the information we could get out of there and using Google Maps. But the big problem with that is that it was very labor intensive, and it would take us one person about 8 hours to do that. Okay. So there was an initiative before I got here to try to get countywide CAD and records management system, a new one. So I explored that a little bit, and we pushed that, and we were able to get the city and county to move forward with that. So we have a new system. It's called Spillman is the provider of it, and so that you've been integral in helping us get that in place and get it up and going. And it seems to most people, I'm sure, that use the city or read the papers about it, that we've had it forever. But actually, we're just coming up on 3 months since we implemented, so it's still very new. And
right.
And these sort of change processes really require a lot of training and use for people to get to know them. This whole change process that we really have to explain to the employees, because many of them expect that they will move from a system that they've been using for 20 years and know all the ins and outs and how to move around in it into the new one and have the exact same capabilities. And there really is a learning curve that once they get over that learning curve, that's when it really accelerates the usefulness of the program.
That's taking them out of their comfort zone into a new tool or whatever, and you have to learn that, and with everything else that takes time, obviously. Excuse me.
Right.
How do you think that affects your officers' time or training, or just getting up with more computer aided, at the touch of a button versus, the old write things down and all that? How do you see that as a...
I think in many ways, once all the kinks are worked out of whatever program it is you're putting in place, and they learn and understand what they're doing, it exponentially provides them with more time to do what they need to do. It frees up time greatly. One of the systems that we put in place here, along with the records management system, is what's called Trax, Badger Trax. and it's a traffic and accident program that allows the officers to write those citations and do the accident reports on the computer rather than doing them on a hard copy. And some people don't see the time savings, especially due to some kinks that are in the program. But even if you take away the upfront time and look at the back office end, there's huge savings, because in the past the officers would have to write out the ticket, and they might only be looking at their use of time in writing out that ticket. But there's a whole back end that goes with it, and that the officers take that ticket and give it to a clerk in the police station, who then manually enters it in a computer. And then that just goes into our computer. Then they take the ticket and send it off to the Department of Transportation in Madison, who then has another clerk that takes that ticket and manually enters into the system. If nothing else, we've eliminated the back office clerk having to enter it manually. Once the officer enters it, it's in, and it can get transferred electronically to her. And then it gets electronically transferred to Madison, so you're losing that work in Madison too. So it's saving there. And we're just about right on the edge of the point where that whole system is going to be worked out. And so even the officer's use of it is going to take essentially a 10 or 15 minute process, and should shorten it to about 5 minutes. And I can just tell you, one of the problems in my past experience here was in Milwaukee when we instituted that. One of the problems that we had is I would have to call officers into my office to tell them slow down and write less tickets, because it was so easy to write multiple tickets that you would have an officer do a stop for one violation, and they would notice 7 other violations, and they would be writing 8 tickets because they could write those other 7 tickets in about 30 seconds. Whereas before it would have taken them an hour to write all those tickets. So they're saving so much time that they want to, what we would call pile on. It really does no good, because at some point the court system in that is going to wipe half of those. So write them for the main violations and include the warning for the other ones, and move on. Just back to the preventative stuff. So the new system really is going to allow us to make that mapping much quicker, so that we can have that. And then you're going to be our right-hand man in helping write some reports that are going to allow us really to pull more specific information. When we notice a trend occurring, one of the things the officers have to do is to try to analyze that trend. So in other words, we have 10 thefts occurring that we've noticed, or 5 thefts in an area. The officer has to go search for all those reports, pull all those reports, try to find out what's going on, which ones are related and aren't. It can be very labor intensive. We're going to be able to have reports that are done instantly for us, pulling all of those incidents out and creating links, which will really speed up the analytical side that the officers have to do. So again, it'll free up more time for them to be out on the street working on the problem with the information that they need, rather than in the office trying to gather that information. And then the last part of that preventative effort is really using studies that have been done on policing and using that information to deploy our resources in the most efficient manner to address the problems that are going on. And specifically what I'm talking about are what we call repeat offenders and prolific places. What we know from research is that probably about 8% of the offenders in our juvenile criminal justice system are responsible for about 80% of the crime. And more recent studies have shown us that what I call prolific places, or they call place-based policing, identifies that the same thing happens with places as what happens with those offenders, and that about 6% of the locations in any given city are responsible probably for about 60% of the crime. So we can chase around that 40% and that 20% and really stretch ourselves and not accomplish a lot, or we can focus on the 8% of the offenders and the 6% of the locations and really affect crime in the city. So having a system that we can pull that data out, again, with reports that are run to show us repeat calls for service at a location and repeat offenders, so that we can focus our resources there, will really allow us to be much more efficient in knocking down crime.
Okay. As a reference to our viewers, the Spillman system was a county-wide initiative for all of our county agencies to take part in so we can share data, so a more integrated approach. And what we were planning on doing on City Desk is having another technology segment once we get further down the road and get the capabilities really flushed out where we're really leveraging the system. So, but it's a good, we're definitely at a good start. So,
oh, absolutely.
So, with the approach, and I can see it's a good thing as far as dividing up the city into neighborhoods and then assigning officers. It almost gives it, instead of a police citizen approach, it's almost like a support approach where, if you ever calling for support for something broken or a product you buy, you call that person and you get to know that person, you develop a relationship. So I can see where that's a good thing, where you're actually developing a partnership with the neighborhood. So
correct. And it's that whole community-based thing. And I think what's really important is realizing the history of policing and what's happened with technology and how that's affected the delivery of service from police agencies. And it's two primary areas that it's happened in is one, if you go back before the development of the automobile, you had the beat officer that was sent out into a neighborhood, and he worked the neighborhood, and his job was really to get to know everybody in that neighborhood so that he could do what I'm talking about, repeat offenders.
Yep.
He knew who the troublemakers were in the neighborhood and where those troublemakers congregated or caused problems, and he focused on that. With the development of the automobile, we end up taking the officer and putting them in a car to get them from point A to point B faster, which is a good thing for us, especially in responding to emergency situations. But at the same time, it put up a barrier between the officer and the public that he serves, and so we get away from building those relationships that we're talking about. So as part of the neighborhood program and the deployments, one of the things that we require is that the officers do what we call park and walk, which means at some point during their shift they have to park their car and get out and walk around the neighborhood so that they can get to know the people that live there, build those relationships and identify the problems that are going on there. Or we've reinstituted the bicycle patrol. Same thing, try to be real flexible with it, put the bike racks on the car so they can take the bike with them, park, and go out and cover more area on a bike, and yet still be able to get back to the car if they need to respond across the city in an emergency mode. So really trying to get the officers out so that they can build those relationships. And we've even used an ATV that we seized from a drug dealer and allow the officers to take that out in the city parks and out on the beach so that they can get around better, but yet still have that ability to make contact with people.
I know you mentioned the bike patrol. I've seen a few squads with the bikes on, and I kind of have to chuckle. At my mother's house, there was a squad car across the street, and she said, for about 3 hours, there's been nobody there. What's going on? And I said, it's probably the bicycle patrol. He's out on his bike and patrolling the neighborhood. So I had to chuckle.
Yeah, and I really can't overemphasize the success of these two things, because the key really is building those relationships, like you said. Because the other area that technology and how things have changed has hurt us is the 911 system. And again, the 911 system is a great thing for getting a police officer or a fireman or somebody in ambulance service to be able to quickly respond to an emergency and deal with it. But it's also handicapped us in that it's created a system that people believe the only way to contact the police is by calling 911. And even if they don't call 911, they call a non-emergency number, there's still an expectation that, well, I called, the police are going to be there within 3 minutes and dealing with my situation. That's great if it's an emergency, but if it's not an emergency, it really hampers the police, because there's so many calls and so many things going on that we have to prioritize them. Otherwise, we're just running from point A to point B and never get the time to really solve problems that are going on. So one of the things we really struggle with is trying to free up that time so officers can have the time necessary to address problems. One of the things that we've done is instituted a differential call response program, in that the dispatchers can ask enough questions to gather information to decide, is it a problem that an officer needs to respond to right now, or is it something that just like any other business model used today by most businesses, cable company, an appliance repair company, and they call you up and say, okay, how about next Friday at 3 o'clock? We can guarantee that we can be there. So we've kind of used that system where if it's an ongoing problem that's not going to get, it's not an emergency and it's not necessarily going to get solved immediately, that problem can get referred to the neighborhood officer, who will then create time where they'll take themselves out of service to go and try to deal with that problem. So you mentioned ways to contact the police. So we've tried to create those ways. And by assigning the neighborhood officers, there's several different things that people can do. They can call up the non-emergency number and say, here's where I live, tell me what neighborhood I'm in, and can you tell me who my neighborhood officer is? And then they can leave a message for that officer, and that officer on their next tour of duty will call them up and say, tell me what's going on, and I'll arrange to meet with you at such and such time, what works for you. And the other way is we've placed all of this information on our website, so they can go and find the map on the website, identify the neighborhood that they live in, and then go and find who the officers are that are assigned to that neighborhood. And they can, again, either call and leave a message for that officer, or if they're technologically savvy, they can, their officer's email address will be there, so they can send an email out to the officer, and the officer can respond back and initiate contact with them that way.
And the website for Sheboygan Police Department is www.sheboyganpolice.com, correct?
Correct. And we're in the process of updating the website. So by the end of August, the new website will be updated, and it'll be much more user-friendly.
Excellent. I know we touched about community policing, and there's also been a lot of talk about it. Anything else you can add, or what that whole initiative is, or expand upon a little bit?
I'd just like to really touch on community policing a lot, because I think there's some misunderstandings in most cities and communities about what really is community policing. And there's a belief many places that community policing is a program. It's an officer who teaches DARE in the schools, or it's an officer that works with senior citizens through a triad program or something like that. And community policing isn't a program. Community policing is really a philosophy. And I brought a printout here from the COPS page. The Community-Oriented Policing Services is the COPS office, and it's out of the United States Department of Justice. And they define community policing as a philosophy that promotes organizational strategies which support the systematic use of partnerships and problem-solving techniques to proactively address the immediate conditions that give rise to public safety issues such as crime, social disorder, and fear of crime. So really, community policing is made up of three key components. Number one is community partnerships, and so that's what we talk about relationship building, essentially. Second one is organizational transformation, and then the third one would be problem solving, and we've talked a little bit about that. And so part of the problem, or what needs to be addressed, is really the second phase there, which is organizational transformation, and that's one of the things that we've tried to do. I got to be careful how I say this, because this is not a knock on what's been done in past administrations of the Sheboygan Police Department. I think they did a really fine job, and they had a community policing unit. Officer Todd Prevey, now Sheriff Prevey, worked there, and he worked under me doing that for a year, and I think he did a fabulous job, and it really helped out. But one of the problems that I believe is inherent, especially in a small department like Sheboygan, or medium-sized department, however you want to define it, is that it really has to be, if you listen to what the COPS office says, it needs to be a department-wide initiative or a philosophy, and it can't be just one officer that's doing programs to support this. Every officer in the organization has to be involved in building these community partnerships and relationships and identifying and solving problems. So one of the things that I saw was a tendency for an officer to develop a problem and then assign it to the community, the CPU, the community policing unit. So assign it to Todd. So I have Todd trying to solve these problems, and nobody else is accepting ownership. So just like we tried to increase accountability by assigning officers to individual neighborhoods, we want to assign that same accountability for problem solving and collaborative partnership and relationship building in what we're doing. So at least for the time being, we've eliminated that community policing unit, and it's not to do community policing, it's really to increase community policing, to make everybody responsible for it. And so I just wanted to get that out there, because sometimes people think, well, they don't have one person doing those programs, they're not doing community policing, and that's not it. I think many times it would be helpful, and you see in many departments and organizations, they have officers that help out in essentially what Todd was doing, but still the core responsibility has to be with every officer. So at some point, we might want to bring back a community liaison officer or a community resource officer or something like that that helps support the work that the officers are doing. But the primary work still has to be done by the average officer day in and day out.
It's like with any organization, it's like no different than police. You got to build it based on customer service and that relationship building. And then the trust is built, and then you get more things done.
Absolutely.
So, okay. I'd like to touch upon now those little arrows on the streets all over the county. Bicycle paths. What's that all about? And I guess what are the rules? Because I've seen bicycles on the sidewalks. I've seen bicycles in the bike lanes. I've seen people rollerblading on each. I guess what is that all about?
Yeah, I'll try my best here. Essentially, the markings on the street are part of a program through a grant that the county got through the Non-Motorized Transportation Pilot Project. And if you want more information on that, you can go to the County of Sheboygan's website and look that up. So through that grant, one of the things that they've done is put these markings on the street. Two different kinds of markings. One is essentially the bicycle without the line, which is really nothing more than something to make drivers aware that bicyclists use the roadway too, and that there's laws that give them rights to the roadway. And essentially the basic traffic law that guides all of that really just says that a driver that's overtaking a bicyclist needs to provide 3 feet of space for that bicyclist to proceed. So these lines or markings really are nothing but something to increase awareness to drivers.
Okay.
So where there is a line along with the marking, what it's really doing is marking off that space for bicyclists to drive and send the message to motorists that this is an area for bikes. So in some of them where there's parking space, you'll see the line. It looks like they're creating another lane. There's really only, in most of those places, there's really only one lane of traffic there. That second lane is a parking lane. And up near a stop sign or something like that, it might also be used for cars to move over and operate as a turn lane. That line does not prevent cars from doing that. Unless there's a bicyclist there, then the car can't do it because they have to provide them with that 3 feet of space.
Right away.
So that's really the controlling issue here is not so much the line, but it's whether a bicyclist is there.
Okay.
Then you asked a question about can bicyclists go on the sidewalk, and I know that tends to be a big issue with some people in the city. Unless there's an ordinance in the city preventing it, and there are some areas in the downtown area where bicyclists cannot go on the sidewalk. Bicyclists, except in those areas, can go on the sidewalk, but just like cars have to provide space, bicyclists have to yield the right of way to pedestrians there.
Okay.
So that's really what the best answer to that.
On behalf of the City of Sheboygan City Desk and Chief Domagalski, thank you for watching. Any comments or suggestions for upcoming shows, please send them to City Desk, care of WSCS TV, and we'll see what we can do with them. Thanks again for watching, Sheboygan.